So our next scripture reading, we turn to the book of Genesis, chapter 45, verses 1 through 15. Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone withdraw from me." So there was no one else about when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. His sobs were so loud that the Egyptians could hear, and so the news reached Pharaoh's palace. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still well?" But his brothers couldn't answer him, so dumbfounded they were on account of him. And then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come forward to me." And when they came forward, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, he whom you sold to Egypt. Now do not be distressed or reproach yourselves because you sold me hither. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. It is now 2 years that there have been a famine in the land, and there are still 5 years to come in which there shall be no yield from tilling. God has sent me ahead of you to ensure your survival on earth and to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of all his household and ruler of the whole land of Egypt. Now, hurry back to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me without delay. You will dwell in the region of Goshen, where you will be near me, you and your children and your grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all that is yours. There I will provide for you, for there are yet 5 years of famine to come, that you and your household and all that's yours may not suffer want. You can see for yourselves, and my brother Benjamin for himself, that it is indeed I who am speaking to you. And you must tell my father everything about my high station in Egypt and all that you've seen, and bring my father here with all speed." With that he embraced his brother Benjamin around the neck, and he wept. And Benjamin wept on his neck. He kissed all of his brothers and wept on them. Only then were his brothers able to talk to him. Grass withers, flower fades, but the word of the Lord lives forever. This is the word of the Lord. All thanks be to God. Joseph could no longer control himself. Joseph, he knew how to put up walls. He knew how to protect himself. He knew how to put up barriers. He knew how to stay tough and survive tough situations. He naturally held his own as a 17-year-old boy, speaking out against his 10 older brothers, who were pretty tough themselves. And he toughed it out, even being thrown in a pit after he'd walked for days by himself to get there. And then he got sold off to slavery. And then he got walked down to Egypt just to be a slave. Down in Egypt, he experienced time in jail. He experienced Pharaoh's wife trying to seduce him and him having to stay strong against that. Always keeping his defenses up, using that dream interpreting gift of his to kind of guide him through the processes of where he's supposed to go, to which he becomes this great and powerful man overseeing the land of Egypt. Even Pharaoh listens to him. Oh, how many tables have been turned in this story, and here they turn again. Carrying the burden of all his hurt feelings of abandonment and rejection, with a heart hardened by the realities of life, Joseph has been pretty tough on his brothers in the last few chapters, and on the whole family. Tricky Joseph, he knew how to run games like his father Jacob, also known as Israel, knew how to run games. Joseph has been making his brothers journey back and forth between Egypt and the land of Canaan, worrying about their own livelihood, worrying about who is going to survive. Now, the boys are all together in this room in Egypt, and now they're all together as men, having gone through all these trials and tribulations leading up to this point, and the guys don't even recognize Joseph still at this point in the picture. It's still a mystery why this man from Egypt is acting in the ways that he's acting towards them. They don't see yet that Joseph has become those dreams that he told them about so long ago. That Joseph has become the sheath that the other sheaths are bowing down to. Joseph has become the one who the sun, the moon, and the stars are all bowing down to. Joseph sees it. He had an idea ever since he was a kid with that unique ability to interpret dreams. And now he's seen it play out for himself. He's living it. It's too much to hold within himself any longer, the power of what has taken place in this family. Can't hold it in anymore. Those walls are starting to find some weak spots. Something's got to give. Now, I love how a professor of the Hebrew Bible, Dr. Roger Nam, says it about this breaking point that Joseph reaches when his super strong, thick walls come crashing down. When Joseph breaks out crying. Dr. Nam said, "It's not a few tears sliding down a cheek, but it's an ugly cry of biblical proportions." An ugly cry. You know, one of those cries where you just lose all control. When the truth speaks for itself, when what we're really feeling shows, when we're overcome by something that's so much more powerful and bigger than any of our walls can put up and guard against or stop from coming in or from letting loose. Now, another thing Dr. Nam mentions is about how Joseph's relationship with God is a little bit different from the people who've gone before him in their relationships with God. It's different from his father's relationship with God, or his father's fathers, or his father's 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 relationship with God. God spoke directly to Abraham. God spoke directly to Isaac. God spoke directly to Jacob and even wrestled with Jacob so that he becomes Israel. With Joseph, God's not been talking to him. It's just his dreams. Joseph's relationship with God is much less connected than we find in the earlier patriarchs. Now, after feeling so much less connected with God all this time throughout the story than those who've gone before him, yet still having a strong foundation for seeing God in the world around him, you know, with the whole dream thing, Joseph has just now reached this moment of full realization, and it becomes too much to hide. This full realization of how God has been with him the entire time, and how close God has been the entire time, and what God has been doing in the background, and he just has this rush where it all hits him. He's overwhelmed, and to his brother's confusion, he bursts out of control in tears, joy, and love. That which God had been orchestrating the whole time. In between Joseph's tears, he explains to them. Explains the whole thing to them. How it all happened. How the dreams came true and what's going on. But you know what Joseph never says is that everything was orchestrated according to how God wanted it to go. Joseph doesn't say that. Joseph never says that God orchestrated the part that Joseph was a favored son, or that he was kind of a brat, or that his brothers would be so awful to him and sell him off into slavery. Maybe that's how it really had to go, the only way he'd get there, but I don't know, it doesn't say that. What Joseph says is, God sent me ahead of you. And God can do that in a lot of different ways. One way or another, Joseph was being sent to Egypt so that he could rise to power, so he could save the family and a whole lot more people too. What God had to work with was a rowdy bunch of young men selling their 17-year-old brother off for 20 shekels of silver. This is what God had to work with, right? And this orchestration. Instead of an orchestration where God might be taking the finest instruments and the finest musicians and putting them together in the finest ensemble for God's perfect music to be played perfectly. You know, it's more messy than that. One year at camp, we were blessed to have Reverend Ilumbe and Django and Mama Rosette from the Congo Disciples Church. And what you see in the picture there is them arriving at camp and me being blessed as one of the directors to get to welcome them to the camp on their visit. And they were just visiting Indiana and the region of Indiana Disciples Churches, and they happened to visit our camp because we had camp that week. And one of the fun workshops that we had that week was kind of a whatever you have band, like where you kind of have a band, but your musical instruments are just kind of whatever you have on hand. Brooms, buckets, dustpans, whatever you can find in the room, around the building, or sitting outside, or anything. Make instruments, and you make music. Play songs together. And it's not the proper orchestration of a philharmonic ensemble, but it's no less beautiful. Perhaps it's even more beautiful. That was one of the biggest things about that visit that got Reverend Ilumbe and Mama Rosette so pumped in the times that they were there. So excited, especially during that visit just with us during the week. They got so excited because of that workshop, and the kids played the song that they made with your Whatever You Have band, and they played it, and it was fun. We kind of rocked out to it, and then they were just so excited afterwards because it reminded them of home. Because back in the Congo, whether in church or just in general, that's what you do. You take whatever you have on hand, turn it into a musical instrument, make something beautiful with it. And you celebrate life in that way. Now, I've got a quote on a coffee mug that says kind of the same thing. Teddy Roosevelt said, "Do the best you can with what you've got where you are." When we put our best forward, especially when we're putting the best of ourselves forward for God, beautiful things come as a result, no matter how imperfect those musical instruments might be, no matter what you're working with from the start. Putting the best of ourselves forward could mean a whole lot of different things. When the emphasis of us putting our best selves forward is about God, then we know that also certain is a signal way of being in us. That calls to mind teachings that Jesus has given us, that God has given us throughout the ages. We know that if the emphasis on God is on God, then that says something about how we're supposed to behave. When we see God using the creative instrumentation that God's got at hand, and here in this passage, the complicated man of Israel, his wives and his children who were plagued by his own favoritism, a family that was crumbling under its own problems, as we find one of the youngest children getting sold off into slavery. We see God work with these imperfect musical instruments to bring about something so incredibly and indescribably glorious in the end. And that something glorious isn't stopped by the imperfect musicians and the imperfect instruments, but that glory is made even more beautiful because of that imperfection, because of how God's beauty manifests through these imperfect instruments. As Joseph said to his brother while revealing to them who he was, now this great and powerful Egyptian, he says, "God sent me ahead of you to save life." To save life. Salvation. The glorious finish to a masterpiece of biblical proportions. Joseph said, "God sent me to save your lives in an extraordinary deliverance." An extraordinary deliverance is something that strikes like blinding light to one whose life needs saving. Light that struck Joseph, light that struck his brothers, light that struck the whole family, and they're reading these stories as they've been passed down, like light that strikes us. Light that's been there from the beginning, that we're not always aware of or open to. In the beginning, God said, "Be fruitful and multiply," right? God kind of has a thing for life. And God wants life to be saved, period. Remember the gospel passage that Barry read just a second ago, a little bit ago, about the woman in Tyre. about how she showed something that just crashed down the tough walls of tradition and separation that stood between that woman and Jesus as a Gentile and a Jew. That thing that she showed that helped those walls come crashing down was humility. Humility. That woman in Tyre showed Jesus so much humility that even Jesus was surprised. Now, maybe the gospel passage today, together with the Joseph passage, can help us see what God's blinding light reveals to us. What it reveals, that there's something that's so great and powerful and amazing that it can surprise even Jesus himself. I'm kind of blown away that Jesus seems surprised in this passage. I'm kind of stuck on that point. Where he goes from not going to bless this woman, and he goes to blessing this woman with great joy. All right, she surprised him, and she caused a great change in Jesus in that moment because of how she was. Jesus is surprised by how well this Gentile is walking by faith. This Gentile is walking by faith better than a lot of Jews I know. And so it totally turns his perception or his attitude or his response around, however we want to describe it. Humbly taking on the position of a dog is what that woman did. Yet at the same time of being so humble, she was also not giving up on her child's right to live life on this earth. She was not going to give up on that. She humbled herself to the point of a dog and said, just bless my child. That is a God-given right and a God-given blessing on this earth to live. And that's what she was fighting for with all of her humility. And because that's what God cares about. God cares about life. And with this emphasis on life and with this humility, she really seemed to cause a change in Jesus that day. One that strikes us as being very different from what we're used to seeing. We aren't always considerate of the right to life for other people. A lot of times we're a little too self-absorbed to do that, or we're only concerned with right to life for certain people and not for other people or whatever. We don't always feel that love for each other, and that's a problem. Across whatever liberal and conservative lines, across racial lines, across cultural lines, across national lines, we don't always feel that love for each other, and that's a problem. I think that's part of our walls that we build up. Joseph held on for a long time before this big reveal. You know, Joseph had a lot of stuff behind those layers of walls that he had built up over time. It takes a lot of humility to let those walls come down. That situation, the whole situation, brought everybody down off of their high horses, which is what we all need. We all need to come down off of our high horses. So, and Joseph, it was brought to tears in this moment with his brothers. With his brothers, they had been changed from slave traders and selling off his brother into people on their knees pleading for mercy. And then what Joseph is brought down to, as they're all brought down together, Joseph is brought down to this ugly cry over the beauty and the majesty of what God had orchestrated and what God had been working on this whole time. As Christians, we are all called to get off of our high horses right from the start. Jesus humbled himself to the point of death for us. And we who follow Jesus, we're called to humble ourselves in light of what God is doing in the world and for the world. Humility. To the point that even Jesus could be surprised by it. The Syrophoenician woman surprised him. Or as Joseph surprised his brothers. Or as Joseph surprised himself by losing control and his walls come crumbling down. And in the end, all together in God's grace and in God's humility, everybody experienced the joy of the Lord together. They were all overcome by this joy that is so much bigger and greater than any of us, and they were all moved to tears. God's orchestration, along with our humility to be good instruments for God to work with, saves lives. God and humility saves lives. May we humbly receive God's calling to go forward with Jesus, to save lives in an extraordinary deliverance, going forward in God's grace, going forward in humility. And may blinding light strike all who need saving.